Hi, everyone. Well, thank you for coming in. I really appreciate it. We have a really interesting and exciting panel today. So let's just get right to it. We're talking about AI and the implications in the carbon market. It's a really exciting time to be involved in the carbon market and with respect to AI. I will just give you a brief introduction to who I am, and then I'm going to pass you off to much more interesting people to my left. So my name is Peter Luis Ruvalcaba, and I work for the London Stock Exchange Group, and I am a carbon credit and environmental market analyst. I joined the company about 4 years ago, and I helped build the North America compliance page and group. And I will now pass it to Toby. So Toby is a, do you want to introduce yourself briefly? Or?
You can go ahead.
Sure. Okay, so Toby Janson-Smith, he is a former Chief Program Development and Innovation Officer of Vera, and he is the CEO and the co-founder of the company Credegra. Then we have Wes Geisenberger, the VP of Sustainability and ESG of Hashgraph, or the Hedera Foundation. And then finally, but last but not least, we have Max DuBuisson, VP, Head of Sustainability, Policy and Engagement of Indigo Agriculture. Okay, so talking about AI, it's a really interesting area and how it affects carbon markets. So this is to all the speakers. So just to kind of get our feet in the ground, what is one way that AI is changing your work today, not just in theory, but what is the scientific or operational challenges that you've already been able to overcome using AI with your respective companies? I'll start with Toby.
Hello everyone, good to see you all. So from my perspective, AI is built into our platform at core. So Credegra is an AI-powered platform, so we're using it to basically improve, accelerate, and bring more transparency to the certification process. Sorry, it's hard to hear? Oh, thank you. Thank you. So yeah, using AI and our core tools at Credegra to basically accelerate the certification process and bring more confidence and transparency to how projects are assessed and validated and verified. And the technology, of course, is growing by leaps and bounds with AI, and it's really exciting to see almost on a weekly basis the new tools and models that enable us and others to do more and more on those fronts.
Please, Wes.
So I think with AI, there's a lot of different types of models and use cases. Most people are focused right now on the LLMs, things like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. And we're often known for our work with this project called the Hedera Guardian, which has built the world's largest library of digitized and open source methodologies. It's used by different standards, different project developers to prove integrity from what's issued all the way back through quantifications, calculations, workflows, and the data inputs. We see AI used to help even generate the templates of those methodologies and every single part of the calculations. You have about 400 methodologies just on carbon credits alone. Every single one of those methodologies has multiple paths and approaches that need to be adjusted and regularly checked. So you can use AI both to generate those forms, those workflows, but also to check to make sure it's correct in an agentic way. We've seen folks actually taking the calculations and the predictions and generate some of those forward-looking statements for 40-year projections as well with AI. And there's some models that are out there that we've actually been able to build into those workflows so that we can better connect what the predicted issuance is all the way back to the source data. With AI on a practical perspective, that's where we see the most value, but we've done a lot of other experiments predicting credit prices based on attributes and data with different types of AI, like recursive regression machine learning models, which are a different category. And as kind of looking at the tech forward way, AI is going to be used a lot more in checking to make sure work is correct, but also generatively creating data sets, which I think will save a lot of time and money for everyone.
Morning, Max from Indigo Ag. So we are project developers, and we work in the agricultural soil carbon space. And we're primarily a technology company, and so different forms of AI are kind of woven into what we do. as Wes mentioned, there's LLMs, but then there's lots of other types of models. And so in terms of how we go about data collection and data validation and monitoring fields, we've deployed a lot of machine learning in building our remote sensing algorithms, enabling us to do things like inferring field boundaries with incredible high accuracy that really helps when farmers are enrolling. Their boundaries are already in the platform, and we get more accurate data, things like that. And then in terms of how it's been changing things, I would say we're definitely seeing the accelerating pace of change in the space, and particularly we've had a lot of good experience using these tools, especially the LLM tools, in code development and in being able to prototype and iterate much more quickly than we used to on our digital tools. And so now, it used to be somebody on the commercial side maybe says, hey, what if we had a dashboard that does this? And the tech team would say, well, that's going to take 3 people 4 months. And now somebody says, well, hang on, let me try something. And then 2 hours later, you've got 90% of it done. And so being able to kind of try things more quickly and be more nimble.
Yeah, that's great. So what are some of the risks associated with AI that you see, and what are some of the things you can do about it? And just looking forward the next 5 to 10 years, what are some of the long-term implications of that risk? Whoever wants to start, please. Do Wes if you want.
So there's a lot of risks.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
If you in carbon markets, bad prediction of how many issuances you may have may break your entire financial model. If you have data sets wrong, that could lead to that outcome. If you're relying on AI to check the data inputs and the AI is missing something, missing some context, that hallucination could cause a scandal, just to be very blunt. Oftentimes AI is good for prediction, and you have to really consider it prediction. It's lowering the cost of prediction, but it is not guaranteeing the integrity. It can help point out the right direction, but there's different emerging technologies for different uses. So we've invested in companies that use AI, blockchain, IoT, and they're all for different purposes. Emerging technology generally has a very specific focus. You can think of blockchain lowering the cost of trust, just like AI lowers the cost of prediction. Sensors oftentimes lower the cost of monitoring. So we've invested in companies, one's called Hyphen, when I was at the foundation, where Hyphen's actually deploying eddy covariance-based sensors or towers in projects, and what they're testing is looking at both atmospheric readings and on the ground truth in real time, collecting tens of thousands of sensor reads literally every few seconds. They use AI to better go through and process that data. They still maintain the raw data, but their predictive output algorithmically is coming from that sensor. They log it on a blockchain to maintain trust and provenance of the integrity of this large volume of data. But these emerging technology tools have to be used in combination to get to a de-risked state. AI by itself, as I'm sure everyone's experienced going back and forth with ChatGPT, if you tell it how to run your life, you're going to end up in a very interesting place, but it may not be where you want to be, and the carbon market would be the same.
Yeah, really interesting. I guess Max or Toby, what are your views on that, just with respect to your individual companies?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's absolutely right in not being sort of, overly enthusiastic about, the AI can do anything, and, running the risk of, basically not keeping the expertise in the room, making sure that the output from an AI is being reviewed by somebody that knows whether it's right or wrong, and also, using the tools for the component that they're best at. And so maybe if you've got a large thing, you don't necessarily give the whole thing to an AI to do. You maybe break it into component parts, and you might have different types of models work on different parts so that they do what's best and that you can check the work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and all good comments. I mean, from my side, I suppose in our space, when we're working on certification with AI, I think one of the big challenges is how do you remove some of the probabilism that comes from AI and create a more deterministic system that's really important for standards assessments. So that takes a lot of tooling and work. It's achievable now, but it's something you have to watch out for. Otherwise, each time you're using an AI to run an assessment or evaluation, you often get a different answer each time, which doesn't work too well with standards requirements or certification. I think the other one is the black box problem, and the sense that it's easy for AI to generate what appear to be smart, robust outputs, but if you don't know what actually generated those, or the evidence basis, or the explainability of those outputs, you really create this trust deficit that can kind of do more harm than good. And so ultimately, we need that explainability, and we need human oversight to make sure that the right answers, and in this case, the right projects are getting through certification.
Yeah, great. Okay, so this question is for Toby. So you worked for Vera for 27 years. You have a wealth of experience, and you helped build the original VCS AFOLU framework. So now you've built Credegra, sorry for mispronouncing. But how does Credegra use AI to analyze compliance gaps in project documentation?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Just to clarify, 11 years in Vera and 25 in the whole market, but yeah, that'd be nice if I could stay in one organization that long. So yeah, from our side, and I'm sure many of you in the room can relate, currently the carbon certification process, getting through validation and verification, can be very painful, very time-consuming, unpredictable. And it's really one of the biggest barriers right now to scaling finance, or basically scaling the supply of high-quality credits. And it's really holding up finance getting to a lot of projects. And so that's an issue that we saw over and over. I also was increasingly aware that what was tripping up projects in certification was often small things. They could meet 95% of the requirements from a standard, but those 5% that they missed or didn't quite have the right evidence, or there was some cross-reference issue, those triggered findings, and each round of findings would last for months, both with the auditor and with the standards body. And that, of course, becomes pretty untenable when you stack up multiple rounds of those findings. And it's just unpredictable. So it's hard for the buyers, the investors, to know when they're going to have the project through certification, when credits are going to be issued. It makes financing very hard, and implementation on the ground if you don't know, how long each time frame will last. And the other thing we saw is that the standards, especially for nature-based projects or other complex project types, is that there are a lot of requirements to assess. So we're talking about hundreds of requirements, and you're looking at hundreds of pages of project documents that reviewers have to assess. And that creates a real challenge for humans to make sense of and consistently assess requirements in a kind of clear-cut, auditable, transparent way. And so seeing all those challenges, seeing how existential it was for projects, increasingly motivated me to co-found Credegra, which basically is an AI-powered platform to help project developers make sense of and navigate the standards requirements, to develop compliant documents, address any gaps, and enter compliance with the confidence. So basically kind of seeing their submission before they submit through the eyes of a reviewer. So they basically can kind of address issues and go in knowing that their documentation is in great shape. And ultimately what that does is it means that they can move much more quickly through developing that documentation with confidence. The auditors have clean documents that meet all the requirements with a very clear audit trail. And it reduces their number of findings, and the quality is increased of the projects and the documentation. And basically it starts to just streamline and build more confidence in the whole process. Let's see what else to mention. Just to say that, AI is not a panacea for everything. Of course, it does some things really well when you're looking at hundreds of requirements across hundreds of pages of documentation. AI can kind of look in a really granular, consistent way at those details. It can look at things like cross-references, calculation errors, It can pick up subtle differences, even on things like safeguards that humans can sometimes miss. But at the end of the day, we do need human oversight. We need human decision-making, ultimately, of which projects get certified. And that's where the auditors still play their key role, including from field visits, looking at supporting documents, talking to communities, etc. And the same for the standards body. We ultimately need humans in the loop, or actually making those final decisions. And then AI becomes a kind of a superpower to increase both the quality and efficiency of the workflow. So that's how we see it, and I think it's really exciting that we're kind of finally at the stage where AI can do some of those things, and it's only getting better and better.
Yeah, thank you. So I think this question would go towards Wes. Can you explain, I'm really kind of out of the loop with regard to what blockchain is and tokenized assets. Can you explain the relationship between something like blockchain, tokenized assets, and how it relates to the carbon market?
Sure. And I think people sometimes get tripped up on the word token. You know, it's something that we dealt with in the carbon market in 2021, and people were really excited about trading these assets. That's one thing you can do with it, but it's also, a token can be a buoy in an ocean of data, is the way I like to think about it. And you can link from a token, an individual unit, a serial number in a project, to both the methodology and every single piece of data along the way. So that means every form, project submission, PDD, validation, verification, monitoring report, all the way through every single data point, whether it's a system, a person, or a sensor generating that data, to the form in the field as it goes through that process, whether it's going through to the auditor, through to a standards body like a Vera or a gold standard, and being able to prove that this happened and this credit was actually backed by robust information to substantiate it. And so we actually had an issuance even last week with, it was the first intermittent issuance out of the gold standard DMRB pilot program. And ATEC Global, the project developer, had 100% sensor coverage on cook stoves, something that's pretty hard to audit if you're sensor generating all the data for the project on every single stove. Most of these projects are sample driven, not real-time data. And what they actually were able to do is Earthhood, the auditor, was able to go through, because the methodology was published digitally, understand that all the calculations were correct. So when the data came in, every form, it's not just a form, it's actually every single meter read on a stove that's being submitted back every single day based on the cooking events. And so what they were able to do is prove every single data point through the process in addition to the other information. Now, because you have confidence in those sensor-driven systems, blockchain's that immutable audit trail of the data. If you've already pre-published on a blockchain that immutable methodology with every path, so there's different approaches in the metered methodology for gold standard, there's a calculation approach 1 and approach 2. They followed approach 2, they followed the path, the data was checked, and now gold standard can intermittently issue every quarter the credits. They do a 70% issuance every quarter rather than waiting for a full issuance cycle, which is historically the way it's been done. Well, you get a token there. Today, that's not traded. Maybe in the future it could be, but what it actually is able to do is prove that every single data point was backed up along the way. Following that calculation that anyone can go look and check the veracity of, check the underlying data. There's a public website that they put up to show that, which is just reading the blockchain. Now, our tool, the Hedera Guardian, is what makes that possible to structure the data, to make it easy to write a methodology, easy to process the data, whether you're a standard, an auditor, or a project developer. And it's open source and anyone can use it. If you look at it differently under Vera, Vera's taken an approach where you go methodology by methodology to be able to do digital submission with what they call Project Hub. Now, you can use our same tool to submit data to Vera, whether it's for a mangrove project under VM33, VM42, and upcoming there's going to be methodologies in clean cooking, rice, ARR for folks following VM47. And there's a bunch of these other methodologies to follow as part of their overarching digitization program. The beauty of this is you're avoiding the PDF. Blockchain's allowing you to not just have an immutable audit trail, but directly submit without building an API. You keep it in your internal system, you understand the forms and the workflows, and what you're doing is enabling an automation that previously wasn't possible. So if you think about, well, what does blockchain do? Is it lowers the cost of trust from the source to who you're submitting it to, auditor, VBB, or standards body. It enables that streamlining, but you can use AI to better check that information along the way. You still need somebody checking the work beyond the AI, but the beauty is if you have this sensor-driven information like ATEC, you can now process it with the trust when you lower the cost of monitoring because it's immutable. You can check it more in a more automated way. And blockchain is one of those tools in the toolbox, just like you would have databases or PDFs or Excel sheets in years before.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, Max. So Indigo is just a fascinating company for me, and it manages some of the most comprehensive and data-rich soil carbon programs. Can you talk more about how AI has proven useful in improving MRV accuracy and efficiency?
Yeah, absolutely. One use case I mentioned before was our remote sensing algorithms, but there's other ways that we use both internally. One good example, when we are using our biogeochemical model, we have to calibrate and validate that model for the purposes that we're going to use it for before we can use it. So that model cal-val process involves finding published data sets of the particular land area and crop type and practice changes that we want to study. We need somebody to have already studied it and taken soil samples over time, and then we can use those soil data to build these validation data sets. It's incredibly labor intensive, and sometimes you don't even necessarily know how useful a particular study is going to be until you go through all the work of pulling and structuring all the data from it. And so some folks on our team used LLMs to build a software tool that they can basically put in the publications, and the tool can spit out structured data in exactly the way that we need it for our cal-val process, and dramatically sped up the process and allowed us, with fewer people putting time into it, to grow our cal-val data set. More data coming in to validate the model means lower uncertainty on the model performance, and so it means more carbon credits, more money to farmers. So that was a really helpful one. But we've also used it a lot on the demand side, because our project generates a lot of documentation, a lot of data, and soil carbon is a new space to a lot of buyers. So we found that there was like a big learning curve that they had to get up. Likewise, our sales team, they're not necessarily the scientific experts, learning curve same way. So internally, we have a tool that they can use, so a chatbot with all of our documentation, that if they're responding to an RFP, they can sort of take a first pass with the help of the chatbot, and then the technical experts just need to kind of review the responses.
I'm sorry, Max, can you get closer to your mic?
Can do. And then on the external side, we've built a data room for carbon buyers that has its own chatbot, so that they can, review everything in their own way. But if they want to search for something or ask a question, they can do it in their own time and know that they're not necessarily just getting sort of an answer from a salesperson.
Yeah, that's great.
Maybe, Peter, I'm realizing on panels I get frustrated when people are less specific and talking high level, which I think I was a bit, and these two gentlemen did a nice job of talking specifically how the AI tools are working, so maybe I'll just say a few words
jump in,
on that from Credegra's side. So basically, we use AI. I'll just give an example of how project developers use our tools. So they would upload their project documents. We've then broken down the standards and the methodologies into hundreds of discrete accessible requirements. The AI then assesses all the project documents against those requirements and the evidence base, and basically determines what's compliant and why. So it gives that information then the auditors or the standards body can use to have confidence that a particular requirement's met. And then it also identifies where there are potential gaps where the documentation may be falling short. And then it goes a step further and tells the project developer exactly how they can fix that gap, what they need to do in the documentation or the project design. So that makes their workflow and the development a lot easier. But then we use AI to add another lens that can be very helpful for the projects, which is basically we've ingested about 20,000 findings from various project review reports and about 11,000 from the auditors. And we use that with AI to basically pattern match for issues that are present in that project that are very likely to cause a finding, and these kind of multi-month loops that hold up projects sometimes for years. So we want to avoid those. Project developers want to avoid those. So basically using AI to identify, in your case, your specific project, Vera or the auditors, are consistently issuing findings based on similar patterns of what your project has. For example, how you've treated safeguards, or weak evidence on leakage, or how your additionality argument may be inconsistent with other parts of the document. And so basically the AI can tell the project developer that these are issues that constantly trigger findings, and here's how you fix them, so you can go into the review process with more confidence and certainty that you can get through in a timely way. So these are some of the ways that we use AI to accelerate the process and give more confidence to all parties, not just the developers, but also the reviewers on the other side, that the right evidence and proof is there that the project is compliant.
Yeah, great. I'll direct this to Wes, but again, anyone can answer. So how would you prevent AI or tokenization from introducing kind of new avenues of misuse, or maybe opening up a Pandora's box?
So you got to design the system with checks and balances. It doesn't matter if it's a regular PDD today with an auditor that's a check and a balance that is checked by a standard. With tokenization, some folks may say, well, what happens if somebody does trade it? What happens if someone builds a market, right? That's a big question from 2021. Well, in our systems, you have what we call a freeze key. Mm-hmm. It means that if you give that key to the standard says it's going to stop, they can press a button and make it stop moving. There's different things that can happen where you say, well, what's the corollary in today's world? You would freeze or pause a registry account. You would say, we're going to put this on hold for the time being. We have those in a blockchain setting natively where controls are decentralized. So only once certain steps have happened that are codified in a workflow could something issue from a token perspective. Now, AI, it's a new technology from an LLM perspective that can be used in a lot of different ways. One of the biggest concerns we hear about when we talk to standards or auditors is there's so much data being generated with AI that being able to comb through what's AI generated versus not AI generated to better understand the checks is a concern, especially as the human eye is going to be less and less able to detect that. You're going to have to use AI to combat AI in a way. Even as we think about building our systems and our open source tools, we've had the conversation, well, if folks are going to be generating code with AI, we need to be able to do that ourselves because folks are going to attack different software systems. It doesn't matter if it's a proprietary system at a project developer or an auditor. They're going to use AI to look at how they can get data passed, how they can look at the software systems in themselves. We've seen all sorts of security concerns about new code being generated with packages inside of it that could be vulnerable. That's happened many times in AI-generated settings, even over the past couple weeks. I think those are some of the big concerns that we have to build our safeguards into the system, just like we've done from a tokenization perspective. But think about it, each user persona. Doesn't matter if it's a project developer, an auditor, a standard, or their software providers. Some of the best practices that we take is we take our open source systems and we do security audits against them. Those security audits may partially be done with AI or automated systems, but those tools are really good as a check and a balance. When you introduce some automation or some AI dependency, you really want to know how can it be manipulated, and that's a good way to do so. There's traditional security management practices for software like SOC. It's a corporate certification. We really need to think about them as we introduce systems that are going to be generating millions of dollars or billions of dollars of value. It doesn't matter if it's a standard or a project developer looking at a specific project. These all need to be put into place and planned out and thought ahead of time.
Yeah. And I guess I could ask Max, is there anything like that AI should not automate that should be, like a human should do instead of machine learning or an algorithm?
Yeah, one example that comes to mind, it's, as I mentioned, we have a number of different remote sensing algorithms that are inferring different things about reality on the ground. So inferring, where a field boundary is, inferring what crop is grown, or when it was planted, or the presence of cover crops. And we've found over the years that we have to kind of constantly tune the dials of how much do we rely on our inferences, how much do we rely on the growers. So if we rely 100% on the growers, that's a lot of burden on them. They have to spend a lot more time checking, all these details and entering all these data. If we rely on the inferences, we've seen there is an error rate. We have, measured accuracy for each of these things. So we know in certain parts of the country, maybe this inference is 80% accurate, 70% accurate. And so we have to build into our workflow opportunities for somebody to check whether it's the grower or whether it's Indigo. It depends on the type of data and what's going to be most efficient, and ways for the farmer to override our inferences. We've found that for example, if we pre-fill in their data the crop type, we look at, they come into the software to enter data for the year, and we've already inferred that they grew corn. Most of these growers have hundreds of fields enrolled in our system, and they're not always like going down like every single list, and so a lot of them were a little too trusting of the inference, and we had to kind of go back and fix them. And so we realized, well, maybe instead of a pre-fill, it's actually a flag. So they put in the crop, and then we see if it matches what we had, and if it doesn't, then we can flag and double check with them that they got it right. But we think we can, trust it more if we flip it around like that. So it's things like that, really just assessing what's going to get it right.
Yeah. Just one thing to add. As you go through these questions, this is part of the system design. It's, okay, well, what's the price of being wrong? If the price of being wrong is, 3 months, they're going to pay more attention to it. But if they don't own the price of being wrong, if it's on Indigo, then they may not care about that price for today. Now, if there's a back and forth in between and you decide, hey, we're okay if they're wrong the first time, but we're going to tell them we think that they're wrong. There's different things that you can do in the system, and that's part of designing that journey, that user experience, where AI can work on both sides of it, not just predict, but also go back and forth and automatically flag. And so as we build like those workflow systems that get from design to PDD to audit to standards, each of the steps along the way need to think about, well, not just one step, but 3-4 steps down the road. And AI can help on each of those steps, but there has to be a human behind the scenes to double check.
Yeah, and those are all great points. And I think kind of building on that is, we need to know how confident the AI is in its determination in certain areas, right? If they're high-stakes decisions in our world of certifying projects, for example, or at least evidence basis saying that this project meets a requirement, in most of the cases, the AI may be very confident and it can map out exactly what the evidence is, what the justification, why the project is compliant. In other cases, it can be an overreach, where the AI, we've all probably experienced this in the AI tools we use, where it has like a false confidence, where actually it sounds good and you're happy to, hit go and move forward with a decision it's made, but actually it isn't that confidence, or as you pressure test it, it equivocates, or as you run another model on it, it comes up with a different answer. And so that's another thing you can do too with AI, and even in your own work, but we use it a lot in our side, is to use different models, different approaches. So you're pressure testing one output against another. You're identifying where uncertainty issues might lie, or lack of confidence. And then those are the areas either you need to do more work on with the tools, or that's when the human needs to come in and actually make a determination.
Yeah, interesting. This can go to anyone, but what is a common misconception about AI that your respective companies have to deal with? Wes, you can go.
I think one thing we need to think about is we still need to, especially in carbon, we still need to meet the standards to a T. You can build a model, and I'm sure Max can talk about it all day. The notebook can get you so far, but unless it's going to meet the exact template of the standards, it's not going to go through the process. And so some of the things we've thought about, even as we use AI to generate the starting point for methodologies, just because it gives you a faster head start, doesn't mean that we don't have 3, 4, 5 checks. So when we had Earthhood check the digitized methodology that was tied to ATEC, they had to go calculation by calculation by calculation, prove it to a standard, look at every variable. When Vera checks a digitized methodology, there's all sorts of manual checks on that methodology, testing, even how it shows up so it's easily understood. Those templates, the only way the market gets to move faster out of the PDF, out of the Excel sheet, is if from when Max works with his farmers all the way through, it's a streamlined process, and it doesn't actually have to cause a systems integration or go back out to a PDF. Every time we exit the system, whatever that system is, to a PDF, to an Excel sheet, to a Word document, we're going to be in trouble. The system's going to slow down. Things aren't going to match. Things are going to break. We're not going to meet the standard to a T. AI can predictively help you get there, but if you rely on that prediction, even if it's 1% wrong, it is still wrong. And sometimes that 1% wrong is one really important calculation or field that can change the project's financial viability materially. So.
Yeah, I mean, from my side, misunderstandings. I mean, I think it's common not just in the carbon world, but generally that AI is going to make humans redundant, or it will take over decision making or a lot of actions that humans are involved in. And certainly in our space of certification, what we see is, as I mentioned, AI is more of a force multiplier, where it allows reviewers, standards bodies, etc., to have taken care of through AI the basic tasks of reviewing hundreds of requirements step by step, showing the evidence, the breakdown, the audit trail. And then identifying areas where humans really add the most value, where they can dig deeper. It might be around field visit or checking out the documents or stakeholder consultations or whatever. But there's still that critical role for humans. But currently what's happening is they're so overwhelmed with making sense of these hundreds of requirements that AI can actually do a better job of assessing consistently, that the humans end up with being shortchanged on the areas where they can add the most value. And so what we see is this evolving is it can really unlock a finite pool of expert reviewers, which there are. There's only so many good VVBs that know the methodologies really well, and the standards body reviewers, etc. And we want to free them up so that they can actually focus on the things where that are most critical, add the most value, and ultimately make the final decisions.
I think the only other kind of misconception I would just highlight one more time is that all AI equals LLMs, and that when we say we're using AI in our modeling, it's not like we're asking ChatGPT like how much soil carbon did I store. It's other types of machine learning, or like our next generation biogeochemical model is going to be an ensemble of multiple models. So we have a neural network that is helping pull all the inputs and outputs together.
Yeah, really interesting. I think something I think about is like as AI gets more intelligent or more sophisticated, is there any red line or like an ethical or moral consideration as AI becomes more and more sophisticated?
I mean, maybe kind of an ethical, maybe it's not so much about the sophistication side, but I think one question people ask is, who's going to have access to this technology? So, if stakeholders, project developers, a small project developer in the global south who doesn't have access to the technology, what does that do to them? Does that put them at a disadvantage, or they can't compete, or it's an unfair, unlevel playing field? We kind of see it the opposite in terms of empowering stakeholders from the south, or less resource stakeholders, in the sense that right now the complexity of the process and project developers making sense of hundreds of methodological and standards requirements means often they have to hire expensive consultants, for example, from the global north. They lose control over their projects, and that actually puts them at a disadvantage. Whereas AI can actually be an equalizer in that way. If any stakeholder, including from the south with limited resources, can get access to these tools, they don't need to rely on expensive consultants or engagement with entities in the global north. They can actually keep their control and their assessments in-house and locally in their country. And they actually then can start to compete with the same sort of outputs and quality of documentation that previously would have only been possible with very well-funded, well-resourced developers.
Maybe I'll just piggyback on that. I think making sure that AI is operating in a way where folks know the risks when they're jumping into it. But at the same time, it is that enabler. We're working with, through our portfolio or ecosystem of application using our open source software. The government of Uganda has been sponsoring an initiative where they can help projects get ready to get access to the market, where they can help digitally fill out the templates because the templates are there. Now, there may be 50 methodologies that they're covering. There's no way that they can have an expert on each of those methodologies and even know which project developers are ready. But if you can help on PDD advisory using chatbots and AI, and the methodology template's already out there, it gives it a shot to go through that process. There are certain things that you have to really make sure that the AI has built into its logic, like making sure that saying if you put this data into this tool and it fills out this information, you need to consider privacy, right? If you just have clean cooking data from every household and you input the addresses and you don't think about the privacy considerations, that has to be part of the design. Consent has to be built into the model. Otherwise, that's going to end up, just like in the past, on a PDF on a website, unredacted. That's been part of the history of the market that we're hoping that can be built into the system the right way, with privacy by design, consent by design, and these are some of the things that, FPIC has to be thought about in making sure that AI isn't taking advantage of it because it doesn't understand it.
Yeah, I think for me, as a professional environmentalist, it's not overusing it. It uses a lot of energy. It uses a lot of water. There are, significant environmental impacts of the data centers that power all of this, and so being judicious about using it when it is needed, and not sort of wasting that power on things that it's not needed for. The one silver lining there is we've actually had a lot of good interest from the data center companies in investing in regen ag around the data centers, because there is, not only this carbon removal aspect, but water replenishment. As you plant cover crops and you reduce tillage, you reduce stormwater runoff, and so some of these companies, like we've announced a partnership with Google, they want to invest in farmers to adopt these practices within their watershed, and then we can verify what they're doing and model the water benefits so that they know they're helping kind of give back to the local ecosystem.
I guess another question, probably to Max, just to follow up. So how do you validate or cross-check AI outputs before incorporating them into like the MRV model or process?
Yeah, so when it's things like remote sensing inference models, it's all about ground truth data. And so those models only get accurate when we can have good ground truth data. And so just double checking them. And then for things like, I actually use a lot like the Notebook LM for just like policies, Vera, Climate Action Reserve, like they put out a lot of PDFs with a lot of dense requirements, and being able to have, a notebook just full of those requirements, but that's referenced. So I can ask it a question, understand what the requirements are, and then go to that reference and actually look at that in the document. That's obviously like always been a part of my job, but now I've got this little friend that can do it a lot faster. And so it's really, whoever said force multiplier earlier, I think that's absolutely true.
Okay, so we have 15 minutes left. I want to open it up to questions. The bad news is we don't have a microphone for the audience, so you guys are going to have to kind of, shout it loudly. Okay, so the young woman right there.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'm Ratnika, and I'm with the Symbiosis Coalition. So I have a question on the demand side. Max, you touched a bit on this with your anecdote about the chatbot being a good learning tool for buyers that might be newer to certain project types. I'm curious if you or the rest of the panel have any other examples of things you've seen or opportunities you see for how developers could be using AI in ways that might make it easier for them to attract buyers or to work with buyers and investors.
I mean, my first thought is really just, there's always been kind of the back and forth of we're producing information, you need information, what do you need, what can we produce, and how do we package it, and what are we publishing, and how. And I just think some of these AI tools can accelerate that and get that feedback loop faster so that the suppliers can understand better how to present information and what do you need to know, and iterate more quickly. And you can, as a buyer, get what you need without, one issue that we have on the supplier side is every buyer thinks, all right, I'm going to make this easy. I'm going to make a template that projects are going to fill out with information about their project so that every project, I can assess them next to each other. And then the next buyer does it too, but theirs is different. And so now it's the supplier's got 45 templates to fill out with the same information, but slightly. And so these are tools that can help kind of reduce that just friction.
Yeah, just adding to what Max said in terms of using AI to help present information for buyers in their language or what they want to see. What we find is very helpful and what we generate through our platform is basically reports and summaries for buyers and investors who can then see how the project is doing in its compliance journey. So it's not just the project developer saying we're compliant or we're going to be compliant in a month or we're only addressing these last few gaps. We can generate basically independent reports that say exactly how the project's doing, where it's compliant, what it needs to still address to enter validation, and that the project developers find very helpful to be able to present and show to buyers who want a kind of independent assessment of their status and and the health of the project.
One other angle to it is we've looked at statistics built into projects based on the audit trails. We've done quite a few experiments with our technology around if you have the full audit trail all the way back to the source data, can you build new types of statistics, not measuring things like just SDGs, but actually breaking that data apart and running different models against that to determine how price sensitive the entire market is in a series of credits in a specific category to a specific standard across vintage years. We did an experiment with this type of accuracy of 93, 94% across the entire history of the market a few years ago. We think that as the data model evolves for the market, it's going to become much more possible to do this in an automated way. But then it goes back to that presentation point. How do you present these statistics in a way that it meets a label? Right now, I would say that anecdotally, we believe that there's a price on the ratings that isn't matching actually what's on the projects. Each rating has a methodology, but it doesn't necessarily come up as a binary. It goes through an expensive process of consulting engagement and is sold. We think that that can be automated and that AI can be used to better automate the pricing on that as well, because price sensitivity shouldn't be tied to an A, a B, or a C. It should be tied very much to the actual project's value, more like how Zillow predicts your price for a house. Then maybe a rating should predict your price. You wouldn't buy a house because it's A, B, or C. You would buy a house because it meets your specific criteria, and you should better be able to run the algorithms against that. And so we've made some of these tools open source, but we know the market maturity still needs to take a step up.
I'll do the, yes.
Thank you. So this is a question particularly for Wes on the use of the blockchain data. All of the calculations have been reviewed. What do you do about the actual real-time collection of data
Sure.
and calibration of all the instruments
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so what you can look is, from a sensor perspective, each sensor is probably going to have some type of firmware on it. But every sensor needs to have its own identifier. You need to be able to pull the raw data, understand how it was processed and what the output looks like in a declarative or kind of a binary way. Now, if you do detect a sensor failure, if you can isolate that and keep it non-aggregated or deaggregated, you can then isolate the problem and then understand if it's something that's reviewable, correctable over time. If that's immutable data, you can still upgrade, that methodology or upgrade that data to show the difference of where it was before, where it was after. And that upgrade really is just a correction. It's basically a journal entry correction on how that firmware was failing, why it was failing, if you can correct it. If the methodology is completely published, that should not affect the end calculation. What you're actually doing is writing over the data, showing the difference, and you can explain why. In the case of what we had in the 100% sensor coverage cook stove scenario, there are cook stoves that fall offline. That's going to happen, especially in rural communities. If you can't isolate them to have an identifier on each one, you're going to have that same exact problem. So when it crosses a blockchain or distributed ledger, what you're doing is you're streaming data and you're kind of putting it inside the sleeve or inside the fields of that methodology to monitor every specific device. Each one has an identifier, each one makes an attestation every time a sensor reading comes off, whether it's every 5 minutes or every 15 minute, like an industrial sensor or a meter, or every day in the case of a low power clean cooking device, oftentimes. And what you're doing is you're pulling the every 15-minute reads or every clean cooking event read, but in that case, it's much more accurate than waiting a month or 2 months to aggregate information, combining it together, and not having visibility off of some type of logging device that's commonly the case.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try to go.
Elmaran from Oregon State University. I just want to have a follow-up question to John's question. So the sensors, and there's also remote sensing, and the AIs. If you could share your experience how you would integrate them towards DMRV that's transparent, real-time, and also persistent over time.
So there's a few different programs that exist. So a good example was the gold standard digital MRV pilot program, where they actually allow a bit of that experimentation, so it is more real-time versus aggregating it later, handing it to an auditor and saying, here's how I've collected this after the fact. When you extend the methodology to include every single sensor point is when you can get to that from a full systems perspective. So when you write a methodology, say it's the eddy covariance one I mentioned earlier, you would have to extend it to allow that sensor data to be input directly to the system. Now with a blockchain, you can have different project developers give permissions to enter data against a specific field, a form, or a parameter. Today, that's kind of in a gray area where that's put into a database or an Excel sheet in a reading. As you extend the methodology, like the DMRV pilot program allows, what you're doing is you're having that system of methodology plus maybe a tool or a module is what we would often call it in the carbon markets that's not today approved or published to be allowed for testing. If that's the case, an auditor is checking it, making sure it's meeting the criteria, meeting the calculations, and every sensor, whether it's a cook stove or eddy covariance flux tower, should have its own specific identifiers on every sub-sensor in that flux tower, going through an algorithm, seeing the output so we can check the raw data against the algorithm. If you log that algorithm on a public ledger, not exposing it or storing it on a public ledger, but can understand the state of it, making sure it's the same inputs and outputs every time, if there is a problem, you can go retroactively look at every single raw reading and say, well, okay, here's what would change, now here's how it has to be updated. The model was wrong, here's the new version, here's how that changes it. There's going to be a lot of experimentation with this technology, especially with the volume of data. AI and different algorithms, they're not all going to be LLM-based tools, they're going to be different types of machine learning models, to Max's point, are going to have to be tested and put through that scientific rigor that each standard has, and it's going to be slightly different probably on a per standard basis. If you say, well, I want to go push this through a standard today, there are multiple programs across the different standards, but you'd have to engage with the auditor generally early to make sure that what you're doing is a validated approach. It meets the terms and conditions of the standards, and it's more of a practical view of it. In a theoretical setting, it often can be a tool or a module proposed to the standard that then they sign off and say this is a clear approach. And what we've been trying to do is help match make a little bit with different technology providers to engage with the standards in different projects as they look to take them forward, and always happy to engage and follow up on that.
Okay, we have about 3 more minutes. Let's go on this side.
Thanks very much. Questions, I think initially for Max anyway. So you alluded to the use of AI, machine learning, in the improvement of the biogeochemical models that underlie estimates of carbon and soil and changes in those things. So kind of 2 questions. One is, how big, how much faster does that tool allow those models to develop? And the corollary question is, how much of a barrier how much faster than the better models allow the production and scale of credit production to expand? So how important are the tools for the model development, and how important is the model development for the market?
Got it. So in terms of speed, some of these use of these models, well, it gets confusing if I just say model, because we have the biogeochemical process-based models, and that's what's doing the heavy lifting for the actual estimation of impact. And then when I mentioned, say, our next generation model using a neural network, that AI layer is enabling us to bring together the best of multiple process models. And so in that case, it's not a speed thing. It's more of allowing us to kind of get to this next phase of modeling and increase the accuracy. And that increases the number of credits that can be generated on a particular field, but also can make us all more confident in the outputs that are coming out. But then the tools like I talked about that we use on the front end where we're validating, that can definitely speed things up. It's like these were tasks that just took a lot of manual effort of expert people that took a lot of their time, and that's where speed can really come into play, is shortening the amount of time a scientist needs to spend to do these heavy lifting tasks. And so that allows us to iterate the model maybe more quickly than we would otherwise, just because of the effort involved.
Okay, we have 1 minute for one more question. I know you were.
Hi, I'm Steve. I run Leaf Time and Technical Consultancy. I had a question for Wes. I think in your opening statement you mentioned using generative AI to create data sets, if I heard correctly. And I was just curious, if you could say more numerical data sets or written answers to questions.
So we've seen both, is the short of it. It's not always the best use of AI because you want to make sure you're describing what's happening with the ground truth. And when we think about the 40-year projections, a lot of times you want to use different AI models to just test your assumptions with all the different inputs, and that's one of the ways that we've seen it used. For us, what we're thinking about is it's fitting into basically a 40-year table, looking at the projections, looking at all the potential variables to try to make sure that we're getting through different maps, getting through different permutations of climate inputs that otherwise could affect that 40-year model. We've seen it in blue carbon, for example, looking at how sea level rise could greatly impact potential issuances. We've seen it in other different methodologies that require a projection ahead of time. And you want to kind of have a high-low view of how you're going to be impacted. But it's really going to depend on your methodologies, on your how advanced your project data sets are going to be.
Yeah, I lied. I'm so sorry. I know you had your hand up, so I want to make sure you get your question in. I apologize.
Thank you. So again, from a project developer standpoint, Max and I'm sure others are finding their own ways to incorporate AI into their processes. And then I'm thinking, what kind of scrutiny does that data you provide get from the standards and the validation, the verifiers? Because do they do like a deep dive to figure out the how you did it, or do they just say, oh, okay, here's the data I expected? How does that go?
Sure. Yeah, I'll clarify that any places that there are AI tools and models being used in our data pipeline or in our quantification pipeline, those things are being ground truth, basically. They're being checked against reality. So in terms of like remote sensing algorithms, we check them against ground truthing and we have estimates of how accurate they are. And then there are site visits. So the verifiers conduct site visits, and occasionally we're finding errors, and then we can assess, is this systemic problem with this output of this inference? And so far, no. But there's basically ways that it can be checked. But otherwise, the tools are kind of being used to accelerate and reduce friction, but the actual outputs and data that are being verified are not, I wouldn't say they're AI generated.
Yeah, and just to add, the verifiers are not going to just take AI's word for it and say, you met this requirement. It's going to have to be evidence-based. But what AI can do is actually pinpoint exactly how and where the project meets the requirement. So it makes then the checking a lot easier and quicker for the auditors. But it absolutely needs that auditable trail.
So one thing to think about is you have to have different features and functions around when you manage data going into a methodology. One is the auditor feedback. So when we built our systems, we've actually worked with different auditors like Earthhood, like SustainCert, to build functions so that you can go line by line to check every individual data point against every single field. That's not an AI tool. It's just a way so you can go back and check, ask questions, clarification requests. Because when you have a sensor-driven data set and you're using AI to check it or maybe even put up notification triggers if something's outside the bounds, the project developer may do that, the auditor is going to do that, and the standard's going to do that, but they're going to have different bounds that they want to set. They may even have AI check those bounds as an agentic tool to make sure something looks within its norms. You still are going to have the human do that, but if you've pre-digitized the methodology and you're having an AI projection put into that, you can better say, well, this fits here, this is what's normal versus all the other projects in that view. If it's on a public ledger, you can also see every single project, how they've done it before to better understand. AI is the tool for prediction, but it doesn't replace every check and balance in the system, how it's designed. It doesn't replace the workflow. It doesn't replace the templates. It's just part of the toolkit that we all need to think about how we get the most out of our efficiencies or out of our checks and balances in the process of working with auditors and standards.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. It was a great conversation, and if you have any more questions, pick our mind after during lunch. So thank you again.